to refill their cup, please come and do so. And come at 8 o'clock next Thursday so we can hang out longer. I miss you guys. All right, so the only order of business I have is to apologize for the lab, which got a little jacked up this week. So the lab was depending upon this NASA website that went completely AWOL, is gone. So somebody brought this to my attention yesterday, and I had to repair it in a flash, which, you know, it's okay for this year. We'll get something better up next year. And then the back half was a Google app that used to be free. It's now behind a paywall, so that had to get scrubbed too. So I tried to repair that as best I could, given the time constraints, but it should be functioning for you now. Let me know if you have any more problems. Otherwise, this is going to be a really, really exciting class because my lovely wife, the brilliant Dr. Bendebury over here, is going to be talking to you guys about the origins of life on our planet. Yeah. So we will have a chance to welcome her up to the podium in a moment, but I need to cover a couple of things that we didn't get to last time. We kind of got cut off in a hurry. Let's see here. We need to talk about the atmosphere, at least very briefly, because we kind of have a particularly important and unique atmosphere, and it obviously plays into the reason that we're all sitting here happily getting all of this delicious energy out of the air to power our bodies through this day. And that turns out to be a rather unique situation. It's also very unique because we have that wonderful magnetic field that we talked about last time. And it was a real whirlwind tour of how magnets work and so forth. And, you know, I kind of introduced this idea of the solenoid to you guys last time. Basically, the basic architecture of a magnet. What's really bizarre is that the internal currents inside of the Earth of all of this conductive material have somehow self-organized into something like a solenoid underneath our feet, a giant one, right? And there's another piece to this puzzle too, which is really important, and that's the core itself. So when I showed you guys this little electric motor last time, what was important to that electric motor and to that magnet was that the magnet only appears when there's current inside of the wire, right? As soon as the leads disconnect during the cycle of the electric motor, there's no magnet inside, and that allows it to reorganize itself every time. That's not the case with the Earth, which is really interesting, because the Earth's magnetic field is really stable, right? And the reason for that is because of this core. So if I would have taken that solenoid and stuck a piece of iron in the middle of it, what I would do is I could reorganize the atoms inside of that piece of iron such that they would also take on a very similar solenoid shape amongst their shells. And you would that would be a more stable configuration, such that if I remove the current, that magnet would still remain to some degree inside of the permanent part of it, the iron core. So that's what's happening with our own Earth too. There's some sort of ironish core. You know, iron, nickel. Nickel's also a really good ferromagnet. It can be sort of permanently magnetized in the same way. So we have this really nice ballast to our magnetic field in the center of the Earth, and that's why it's so stable, right? You look at the sun, which is all molten, and its magnetic field is flip-flopping constantly, right, every 10 years or so. And ours seems to be flipping really slowly, on the order of close to 1 million years, right? So that's really cool. Another point I wanted to touch on, though I've mentioned it before, is you might ask, okay, all these atoms and their shells are doing this stuff, but magnets seem to kind of work outside of the actual object, right? You get close to a magnet and you feel its presence, right? If you're a piece of, ferromagnetic material, if you're made out of iron or something that is magnetizable, right? But one thing you have to keep in mind is that these nice orbital diagrams that you do in chemistry, they're only talking about where most of that electron is, right? These are the actual distributions of the electrons. And so that 1s is kind of, you can think of it, that's the shell. This is distance from the nucleus on the left over here. But what happens is actually the electron's presence falls off precipitously after that shell, but it still continues a little bit. And so we have some idea that the actual atom is in some sense diffused to some degree, right? It's reaching out much further than that actual shell. And so that the effects of these processes that are happening at the shell surface would persist kind of makes sense, right? So we have this bizarre action at a distance, but it might not be so bizarre after all. Anyways, this is the convection cells I was talking about. And of course, this fluid rotation of this molten conductive stuff under our feet has a lot to do with actual spinning of the Earth itself, right? It's this kind of gyroscopic machine in some sense, and gets the goo, that conductive goo whirling. So that sustains our solenoid. What else do I want to say about that? So the reason that this matters so much is because of this stuff called the solar wind, which we'll get into a lot more next semester when we talk about the sun. But the solar wind is actually a relatively recent discovery. As far as it was basically developed by this guy named Eugene Parker, who took note of some interesting observations that people had made before him, such as the fact that comet tails always seem to be oriented with respect to the sun, right? And why is that? It's almost like they're being blown away by the sun. And he started, studying this phenomenon a bit, and really started to develop this idea that there was actual ionized material flying off of the sun at all times. Turns out it's going really, really fast. It actually accelerates as it moves away from the sun. It gets faster as it leaves the sun, which seems really bizarre. But what they think is happening is that the sun has a lot of gravity. And as you get away from that gravitational influence, right, it falls off with an inverse square law like we talked about. You actually don't have that restraint anymore, and the particles can then move away with all of the energy that they had in the first place. Now, that's a little bit half-baked. This is a really cutting-edge field of understanding, and it turns out that these structures, this flow of material, actually creates its own magnetic influence, right? Because it's a moving these moving charged bodies, and so in some sense, the magnetic field of the solar system itself is sustained throughout the whole thing, and it creates this very beautiful structure, which is in some sense self-organizing. Anyways, all this to say that all that really hot stuff, all that really charged, really actually quite dangerous stuff is flying at us at gazillions of miles an hour. But because it's charged, it is able to be deflected by this wonderful magnetic system that we have set up under our feet here on Earth. And it's in some sense the reason that we probably even still have an atmosphere today. Otherwise, we might find ourselves in the same position as a lot of those exoplanets we were talking about that are getting their atmospheres ripped off of them. And so we have a pretty stable, wonderful, nice little Goldilocks situation here on Earth. We're in a position where we're in the exact right spot in the solar system where we can still have liquid water, right? Nobody else is able to do that. It's either evaporating or it's frozen. And then we don't have to suffer this brutal solar wind because we have this nice envelope that shields us. All right. Yeah.
The lava in the middle that you're talking about is turning, and it's a lot of metal based. Is it gaining magnetic ability from actually to the friction too?
Yeah.
On that transition?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's pretty neat.
Yeah, it's interesting how these systems self-organize, right? I mean, magnets in general, if you think about that solenoid system, which is the basic shape that essentially that these atoms need to organize themselves into, at least their relevant surfaces, right? It seems to appear over and over and over and over again. It seems to be, in some sense, a really dissipative, like it's a very energetically favorable process. It's easy for them to do it. It's easier for them to organize that way than to be chaotic, right? In some sense, it's like the fastest way, like if you pour a bunch of water in a sink, it rotates down, right? Because that's, in some sense, the easiest, most efficient way for it to do it. It costs the least, right? in terms of effort. And so the system's sort of organized that way. And one of the consequences with conductive materials is that you get the alignment of these shells, you get the production of a magnetic field.
Extremely convenient.
It is. Everything here is extremely convenient. That's the mind-boggling thing. And I think that's what we're going to find when we start thinking about what life is. Because, life seems so improbable and ridiculous on one hand, but it's also quite easy. And I mean that in like an energetic sense, in that it's actually, in some sense, the easiest way to chew up the environment and actually deal with these chemical reactions. So all these things are inevitable, and that's kind of the beauty of the situation we find ourselves in, is that on one hand, they're extraordinarily improbable, but if you go outside and look up at the sky at night, there's a lot of opportunity, right? So it happens, and in some sense it's a miracle, and in some sense it's absolutely expected and understandable, which is just kind of the mind-bending duality you have to hold in your mind. So I don't want to say too much about the atmosphere. I do want to point out to you that essentially this is, wow, that's a pretty grainy, terrible picture. I'm sorry. I think I took this from your textbook. What I'm trying to show you here is that the pressure, the atmospheric pressure falls off with distance, which makes sense, right? Because the gravitation is also falling off with height. And so the way that a lot of, particularly, let's say, people who navigate the atmosphere, like pilots, they actually measure height in terms of pressure, which is quite interesting. And I'll show you a cool map in a second that you can check out. So the atmosphere is organized in this layered structure. And of course, the place where we exist and where we have weather and all of this fun stuff is called the troposphere. And if you go way above that, say 50 kilometers, you end up in the stratosphere, which is a very cold place, and it has very predictable flow patterns to it. It's not as chaotic, right? You don't have all of these swirling storms and so forth. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that it's just so cold, it's less dense, and so there's just not as many bottlenecks and train wrecks going on amongst the molecules there. I wanted to mention ozone to you, which is quite interesting. The presence of ozone is actually quite useful to us because, the magnetic field does a good job of shielding a lot of those high energy atoms that are flying off the sun, but we still have radiation to contend with, right? Now, radiation, in some sense, is stemmed by the presence of our clouds and so forth, which is quite useful. We looked at the transparency of our atmosphere to different wavelengths, but UV is actually a real nightmare because in some sense it can penetrate through the clouds and so forth. But there's this molecule that's formed in the upper stratosphere called ozone, which does a great job as a little antenna of absorbing UV light. And without that, the UV would actually probably tear up our DNA pretty badly. And one of the sort of massive success stories of science that your textbook is pointing to, and I think in some sense it is a compelling story, is the presence of this hole which showed up sometime. It was a big deal when I was a kid, so I guess it was discovered in '85. And what happened was people kind of realized that there was these synthetic chemicals that were being used as coolants in refrigerators and so forth. And these were actually leading to the degradation of ozone in the atmosphere. And they figured this out really quickly, and within 2 years, they had made some sort of international agreement to stop using these chemicals. And as a result of that, the story goes that the hole in the ozone completely healed itself over the course of the next 10, 15 years, which is a lovely story of the success of science and progress. However, it seems like the ozone hole is coming back. I hate to break it to you. So I'm not sure what's going on with that. Do you have any insight on why it's coming back?
I don't know that it ever went.
I mean, this is a picture of it from '81 through 2016, and it seems to have disappeared a little bit by 2016.
If you look at a chart of the there's definitely a couple of years where it seems to close, but for the most part, it just persists, which is weird because that would suggest that the mechanism by which it was formed in the first place might not have been the correct mechanism.
Yeah, it seems like it might be time to reconsider that story in some sense, I guess is why I'm bringing this up, because this often happens that we pat ourselves on the back for solving some problem, and it turns out that we didn't actually understand the mechanism in the first place. And so, it's great that we have the ability to stand around as a human race and be like, hey, I think these chemicals are bad and we should maybe find an alternative, and that we're able to implement that's a pretty cool success story. Now, whether that was effective, is a completely different story that takes maybe years and years to iron out. All right, let's talked about this already. There's some interesting, so the textbook talks about the origins of the atmosphere. This is very much an open question. There's basically three theories, excuse me, for where the atmosphere came from. The first one is that it sort of formed with the rest of the Earth. It accumulated from debris left over from the formation of the whole solar system. Second one is that it was formed through the release of volcanic gases, right, during the initial and, well, I guess over the course of the formation of our planet, which is really intriguing. There's these volcanoes actually emit a tremendous amount of water vapor, tremendous amounts of gas. So that's kind of compelling. And then the story that was told when I was a kid was that all of the water and all of this atmospheric stuff came from comets, which I think I mentioned to you was a bit hard to swallow even when I was a kid staring at the ocean. That's a lot of comets. So nobody knows exactly is the answer. There's been some really interesting papers. One paper I really liked that came out I think a couple years ago in the journal Nature showed this idea that the early planet had this very thick hydrogen-rich atmosphere, and various interactions with the silicates, with the crust and the cooling magma led to chemical reactions which produced the water vapor and everything that we see, the nitrogen, the oxygen that we have in our atmosphere. So our atmosphere is mostly nitrogen, like 80%. And there's 20% oxygen, and then there's a little bit of other stuff, trace gases of various things, carbon dioxide being one of them, argon, a bunch of other little trace gases that you can imagine. So it's predominantly a nitrogen atmosphere. Nitrogen's inert. It doesn't really interact with chemically too much. As a diatomic gas, it doesn't do much. So it's just there. It's adding pressure, and here we are. By the way, we're all under a tremendous amount of weight from all of this gas right now. I'm not sure if you're aware of that. I had it written down somewhere. It's actually quite an extraordinary amount of weight. Did I write this down? Oh, there we go. So there's something like every square centimeter of your body, let's say, or anywhere, is feeling about a kilogram pressing down upon it, right? So that's a lot of weight that's squishing on you. The good news is that it's squishing on you from all sides. And so as a result of that, it's squishing on you from the inside too. And so you have this pressure equalization. There's these fish at the bottom of the ocean that are under way more pressure than that because they're getting squished by columns of water. But it's equalized. That's the amazing thing about pressure. So the inside of their body is also pushing back with the same amount of effort. And so you don't actually squish the fish. But if you bring those fish up to the surface and all of that pressure is released, then the fish fall apart. It's actually really gnarly if you see some of these deep sea trawlers that pull up these fish. I mean, these fish don't even have eyeballs. Like, they're very strange looking animals. But, biology finds a way. Another thing that's worth mentioning is the electrical processes that shape our world here, which are quite fascinating. So, actually, I'm going to come back to this in a second. I want to show you this map. I don't actually have time. Maybe I can, I'm scared if I click on this if it's going to destroy my slideshow. Oh, here we go. Yeah, so this is a really cool interactive map. This is called earth.nullschool.net. Write that down. Check it out. It's really cool. You can play with this, and you can go and zoom around. You can check out different layers of the wind patterns on Earth. It's a really, really cool program if you're trying, especially when we're facing one of those winter storms or there's some weather pattern. You can really start to get a sort of predictive sense of what's going to happen by looking at these patterns. And you can go all the way up into the stratosphere and back down. Really, really cool system. Null School, earth.nullschool, I know it's a weird name, Null School, N-U-L-L School, .net, I think, .net, earth.nullschool.net. Really fun one to play with. Yeah, I didn't find a way to navigate this thing in real time right now without going over to the other screen. Maybe I should, though. This is, all right, I'm going to show you guys. This is pretty rad. So, I can go over here. Where is that hurricane? Over here, eh? There we go, this thing here. Yeah, and what we can do, this is kind of hard to navigate on the big screen, is we can go and look at different heights. So the heights are listed in pressure, like I said, which is very bizarre, but if you think about it, it kind of makes sense. The really high pressures are near the ground. But if we start to move up in pressure, we can actually see that these systems start to dissipate at higher altitudes, right? Now it's becoming more laminar up top. And then at some point, when you get really high, you basically lose, although the wind speeds are quite intense there, it's basically laminar at some point. So this is essentially the stratosphere. And it's very, very interestingly laminar. Now what's really interesting here, by the way, is that the winds are flowing in very opposite directions at the equator than up top at the upper latitudes, which is really something to behold. All right, so play with that. It's really fun, especially if you're, the next time we get some serious weather, go and check it out. Really, really useful tool for getting a grip on what's happening with the planet in general. And you can start to pick out some patterns that are interesting. Okay, so lightning and so forth, which is really interesting. So what's up with lightning, by the way? You know, this turns out to be really important. So up at the very top of the atmosphere, there is this interaction with the magnetic field, right? And there's the bombardment with all these solar wind particles, and there's radiation, and it's just a roiling sea of electrical activity. That turns out to charge the upper atmosphere in a way that is different than the surface of the Earth. And so what you do is you essentially have set up something very close to a battery, more like a capacitor, where you have this insulating layer, which is the atmosphere, the lower atmosphere. You have a difference in charge between that area at the top that's interacting with the cosmos, essentially, and the Earth. And periodically, the storm systems will nucleate little particles that can act essentially as little wires. And that's how we basically get these arcs of conduction between the upper atmosphere and the Earth. And we see these as lightning bolts and all sorts of electrical phenomena. And that's really cool. Contain? I mean, I believe that, I mean, well, when the lightning happens, most of the atmosphere is nitrogen. So it actually rips so when I say the atmosphere is nitrogen, it's actually two nitrogen atoms stuck together very inertly. They don't do much. But when a big enough electrical path is opened up, essentially when these atoms align in such a way, those get ripped apart. And so you actually can. They do, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's a reasonable interpretation of what's happening. I think that's a fair way of thinking about it. I think that's a fair way of thinking about what electricity is, in some sense, is that the atoms are, in some sense, they're aligning with one another, and they're imparting that motion, that electron motion, between one atom to the next, all the way down to the Earth. And so what's really, a good demonstration of this is that if you have an atmosphere, like on the left here, this is just something like artificial lightning, right? It's high conduction arcing across the air. You see how it branches out and tries out all of these paths, right? Because there's a lot of atoms there for it to do it. But if you pump down to the vacuum, you remove most of the atoms, all of a sudden there's only one path available because there's very few atoms. So you get very clean, straight lines in a vacuum of the arcing there. And so I think that sort of reinforces this idea. But, this is, I think that's a really good way of thinking about it. I would say that people in textbooks, a lot of scientists don't really bother too much with trying to make sense of it in that way. They're very, very good at quantitatively describing what's happening in terms of the charge transfer and, the dynamics of that and being able to manipulate those paths. But I don't see anybody really concerned with what the atoms are doing too much. So that's a huge field of development. Again, we talked about the rationalists and the empiricists, right? We live in an empiricist-dominated scientific climate. It's all about describing with numerical accuracy what's happening. It's not really about rationalizing what the actual material bodies are doing so much anymore. But I think it's a valuable thing that will probably make a resurgence at some point. All right, a couple more things I want to say about this. The cool thing about that ionosphere, right, the lid that we have on this whole atmosphere, is that the fact that it is conductive and the fact that there's these teeming swarms of conductive atoms means that it acts a little bit like a metal, which means that it acts as a really good antenna in some sense, and we can use it for radio signaling. So you'll often hear about, especially in the early days of radio communication, people would skip radio signals off of the upper atmosphere, and they could actually bounce things around the world that way if you wanted to talk to somebody, say, in Japan or something. It might be, I guess that's not quite on the other side of the world from us. Let's say you want to talk to somebody in Africa. You could skip those radio signals across the upper atmosphere, which is really cool. And that is all I have to say about the atmosphere. So now we need to talk about how the atmosphere, how this Goldilocks zone, how all of these things have conspired to put us here in this auditorium today, which I think is, in some sense, one of the most complicated and intractable problems in all of science, because I've said it before, I'll say it again. On one hand, as we'll see, and we've talked about, life only seems to come from other life, right? We're not in danger of going home to our dorm rooms and finding a little living organism that didn't, like there's not going to just be a baby just sitting there, right? They don't happen by accident. Well, they can happen on accident, I suppose. But they don't just pop out of nowhere, right? So life comes from other life, but that doesn't solve the problem of what happened in the first place, And there's a lot of people who try to make the argument that, okay, maybe the earliest bacteria and so forth came from somewhere else. But then it's like, well, how did they come from there in the first place, right? So this is, in some sense, one of the biggest questions of our time. And I think it's been a huge question for hundreds of years. And anyways, my lovely wife, also a professor in the biology department, is going to talk to you about the origins of life because it's something she's particularly knowledgeable and passionate about and involved in a lot of discussions with people who are working on this at cutting-edge institutions. So yeah, I'll let you take over. I'm going to give you the mic. And
I got my PhD in bacterial biofilms. So basically, what I was studying was I was trying to figure out how is it that bacteria, when you grow them on a plate, form these crazy shapes. I don't know if you've ever taken a microbiology class. I don't know if you've ever allowed some yogurt to get too old, and then you open it, and on the inside you have all of these round circular things. Those are colonies. And those colonies all have very discrete and specific ways of talking to each other. And so when you dive into the world of those colonies, it turns out that they have tons of electrical signaling. They're approximating what a multicellular organism does, and yet they're made up of what we take to be individual cells. And so there's a ton of really interesting things you can learn about biology when you look inside of bacterial biofilms or mold biofilms or whatever. But when you study biology, you think you're going to study life. And you think that you're going to figure out what is the origin of life. But it turns out that nobody has an answer to that question. And in fact, most people don't even really have a super solid sense of what life is. And so I wonder if you who are sitting here, do you have a sense of what life is? Like, does anybody have a definition? Even an operational, a working definition? If somebody stops you on the street and is like, what is life?
I guess I would just say an organism that is living, breathing, and has a cognitive function.
Okay. All right, does anybody else have a different one?
You know it when you see it.
That's true. We have a tendency to not ever. How do I advance this? There we go. We have it like, you never make the mistake of looking at something that's alive and being like, that's not alive. You don't ever make the mistake of looking at something that's dead and being like, that's alive. You can go through the world and you can kind of clearly categorize what is and what isn't. And yet at the same point, this definition of it's a thing that an organism does. If you open up a biology textbook, you'll usually get a list of characteristics. It reproduces, it has homeostasis, it has compartments, it has organelles, it has heritable material, and all of these things are not life, they're cells. But this is the way that we tend to think of life. We tend to think of life as being what cells, like, that life and cells are inextricably linked. But I think that there's a deeper question here, which is that life happens to be what cells do. And so cells might be the most basic form of life that we can easily identify, but it is a process that must begin before cells. And if you look at the simplest cells, if you look at bacteria and you look at what it is that they're doing, you discover that they are this magical interface between the inorganic and the organic, where the inorganic is stuff that is minerals, it is rocks, it is silicates, it's the stuff that you talk about when you talk about the planets. It's the atoms moving in spiral circles to create the magnetic field. But then the organic is us. It's everything that's wet and squishy and can do the things that cells do. And so the simplest forms of bacteria are the ones that literally take rocks and turn them into organic things. They breathe rocks. They're called chemolithoautotrophs. And what that says is that they are organisms that are capable of respiring by using what's inside of rocks or using like hydrogen gas that comes from the inside of the earth. And so the most basic foundational form of life that we have on Earth right now is the stuff that is the interface between planet and life, because you can build a pyramid on the surface, on the backs of those microbes to get to everything else, right? Because you have bacteria that suddenly take rocks and make it into something squishy. Those bacteria die, they're fed on by something bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and then you have forests, you have whales, you have humans, you have whatever. But it all begins at that interface between rock and life. And yet, we don't have a good sense of how that interface is built. And so trying to figure out how it's built means that we have to start thinking about chemistry and reproduction and patterning and the molecules that make up life and how they could possibly come out of just a soup of rock, basically. So does anybody know what this is a picture of?
Is it sediment lines?
It is the sediment lines of the earliest life on Earth. So this is a picture of something called a stromatolite. And so if you go back to the earliest Earth, so we don't have a terribly good sense of what the atmosphere of the Earth was like back at the beginning, but and we know that it's that we don't have a good sense of it because it changes every few years. You go back to papers that were written 10 years ago, and our sense of what the origin of what the atmosphere of the Earth looked like 4.5 billion years ago is one way. You go back 10 years ago, it's another way. 6 months ago, it's a third way. And so clearly, we don't know exactly what was happening. But what we do know is that when we start looking for fossils that are the oldest fossils that we can find, we find fossils that are about 4-ish billion years old, and they're this. And what this is a massive solidified biofilm. This is basically each layer is a layer of cells that lived, died, had their full experiences, and then we're encapsulated by more cells and more cells and more cells. And so they turned into rocks at this point. But this is the earliest form that life, as cells, took. Some of this...
Can you speak a little bit louder?
Yes. Maybe. I don't have your projection. So some of this is inevitably a filtering problem, right? Because I'm sure that you guys have looked at fossils before, right? What is the process by which a fossil is formed? Does everything make fossils? It doesn't. Like, you have to fall into just the right conditions with just the right thing that happens afterwards for you to actually form a fossil. This is a little bit gory, but think about it. Like, if you've ever seen a deer get hit on the side of the road, and then that skeleton gets left there, and if you walk past it, the skeleton eventually, it just dissolves if it's on the surface. And maybe you'll have a bone here, you'll have a bone there, but like it goes away because the rain dissolves it, the chemicals that are in the drainage ditch dissolve it. And so most things will not leave a fossil. And so whatever window we have on the earliest life on Earth is a filtered window because the only things that we have to look at are the things that have left fossils. And so we're stuck trying to reconstruct the picture of history with this terribly, terribly incomplete map of what was once there. But so we deal with these stromatolites and we accept them as being the earliest thing that is possible because there's just no other evidence of anything. And so, okay, bacteria were the first ones here. But you're still stuck with this problem that Dr. DeLay mentioned, which is that how did the bacteria get here? Some people believe that they came from somewhere else, but then you still have this problem of, okay, well, they came from somewhere else, but they must have formed there, so how did they form there? For a long time, the way that we dealt with this is we had this theory of something called spontaneous generation. We were like, you know what, life just appeared. And so this is a really famous experiment that was done in, I think it was in the 1600s, by this guy named Francesco Redi. And Francesco Redi he knew that the understanding that life could come from nowhere was kind of messed up. Because, so Aristotle is the foundation of most of Western metaphysics for about 1,000 years. Aristotle, ancient Greek, 300 BC, writes on everything. He's like on physics, on nature, on stars, on the cosmos. He lays out in probably dozens of books how everything works. He is the tutor of Alexander the Great, so he is this massive figure in history. And he's like, life emerges spontaneously from other things. It just comes. And he has all these recipes in his books. He's like, okay, so to make mice, you take straw and dirty rags, and then mice come from the mixture of straw and dirty rags. To make scorpions, you take 2 leaves of basil, you press them between hot bricks, and scorpions come out. To make bugs, they come from gall, like the galls on the oaks spontaneously generate bugs. And this is cutting edge metaphysics for life for the next 1,000 years. Because there's a lot of reasons for it. And so you look at Aristotle and he's right at the cusp of the fall of Greece, the rise of Rome. Rome takes over the world, then Christianity comes, but Aristotelian metaphysics maintains because it's this picture of the world. It's a full system of the world, and I think that it just got so chaotic that nobody could come up with a better system. And then the church really liked it because he has this, it's a deeply spiritual version of the world where you have that there's this terrestrial realm and it's imperfect, and then you have this celestial realm and it's perfect. And so we have this reflection of religious metaphysics onto Aristotle. So it holds for forever. And then, like, in the Renaissance, people start being like, I don't know about that. That might not make sense. And so the church is still in full force. It's still burning people at the stake for saying that the sun is at the center of the solar system. Like, people are definitely not making a lot of noise about the fact that the church is wrong. But Francesco Redi is like, hey, okay, so everybody thinks that maggots spontaneously generate meat. They're like, you leave meat out, it starts to rot, and maggots just magically come out of it. And so that's the picture that's on the left here. You have an open container, maggots form. They're like, clearly the maggots are made by the rotting meat. And Francesco Redi's like, I don't think so. And he does a really simple experiment. He literally leaves a piece of rotting meat out, but he puts a piece of gauze over it. And he discovers that instead of forming on the meat, the maggots form on the gauze. And he's like, check it out, there must be something else that's making the maggots. That's not the meat, because if you separate them, it works. And everybody looks at Francesco Redi and they're like, uh-huh. And then for another 300 years, they argue about whether or not it's happening. Because I actually can't tell you why, because they've figured out microscopes by this point. They can look at stuff, they can see. There's this guy, Antoine van Leeuwenhoek, who invented the first microscopes. And he's also a really funny character because he invents microscopes, he makes all of these books, and he fills them with drawings of nanomolecules, is what he calls them, because they're these little molecules that are moving, and they have shapes to them that are unique, and so he catalogs all the things he sees in pond water, in rotting milk, in bodily secretions. But microscopy is basically a useless profession, and so Antoine van Leeuwenhoek spends his entire life doing it, but nobody follows his footsteps. And so there's just this isolated pocket of microscopy, and then later on you get people that get into it more and they start to develop it when we start to get cell theory, and we've got like the Robert Hooks and everybody else. But that's still another like 200 years later, because Antoine van Leeuwenhoek's in like the 1600s. So it takes us until the 1800s to finally say that spontaneous generation doesn't happen. Like late 1850s, Louis Pasteur finally comes up with an experiment that he can do that is, to him, sufficient proof. He takes a flask. It's called a swan neck flask. And so basically it's this big bulb, and he puts broth in it, and he stretches the neck out so it has this curve to it, so that the bottom of the curve has a little bit of water in it. And so it can exchange gas, but the water acts as this filter, and he sterilizes it. He boils it until it's clear, and so he puts it on a shelf. It sits on a shelf, and you can leave that flask on a shelf for as long as you want, for months, for years, whatever. And then when you snap the neck of the flask off, within a few days, it becomes contaminated. And so to everyone, this is finally sufficient proof that there's nothing in the air that is generating life out of nothing. There's not this vital force that's inside of oxygen or inside of air that can just make life come from nowhere, because the air is getting in, it's passing back and forth. There must be something that the air is carrying that gets filtered that is necessary for the generation of life. And this is the place at which we start to have to really deeply think, like, okay, how does life form if we go all the way back to the beginning? Because at the beginning, so we admit now that there can be no spontaneous generation inside of our world today. But if you go back to the very source, to the very first moment there was the very first cell, that must be spontaneous generation, because you have something that is coming from not life. You have a cell that emerges from something that is not a cell. And there's this long path of evolution, billions of years, and you get plants, you get animals, you get complex organisms. But at the end of the day, we have this germ that remains of this massive question. Life must come from not life at some point, despite the fact that this is a law that we have today, that all life comes from life. And so this is a really, really intractable problem, because the molecules of life are very complex. So like this is a piece of DNA, this is a piece of protein. On the left side, you have all of the different DNA base pairs. On the right side, you have all of the different RNA base pairs. Have you guys seen this before? Okay, so most people are familiar. But there's this thing called the central dogma of biology, which is that everything starts from DNA, which is the heritable material that's inside of cells. That DNA gets made into RNA, and then that RNA makes proteins. So it's this linear process by which you go from heritable stuff to information processing to proteins that are actually the molecules that go around in your cells and do stuff. the complicated aspect of this is that these molecules are very, very advanced. Like the cellular machinery that is needed to be able to replicate DNA and to make a new version of it that gets passed from organism to organism, and all of the machinery that's necessary to make RNA from DNA and then proteins from RNA is just extraordinarily complicated. These are massive molecules that have tons and tons of information necessary to make them in the first place. And so you're again stuck with this problem of like, okay, how do you get to the first piece of DNA that's able to encode something that is actually carried forward into the next generation? And so
It's really unstable too, right?
DNA is actually pretty stable. RNA is not particularly stable. And so the proteins are also, once they fold, they're stable. But if you ever crack an egg and you cook it, what happens is that all of the proteins that are inside of the egg white and the egg yolk are unfolding, they're denaturing. And so temperature, any kind of changes in acid or base chemistry will unfold your proteins. And so you have all of these like very delicate molecules that you need to accumulate in abundance in order to produce some kind of viable life form. And so the current thinking is that you basically have random chemistry that's happening inside of the Earth, and it's just kind of this random walk motion where you go from chemistry to some molecules that are ribonucleic acids. And people like ribonucleic acids for this because they're single-stranded, so you don't have to have two copies of them. And they also seem to have some kind of templating ability. So basically you have, they're kind of like little crystals, where when you have one piece of RNA, it's possible for that piece of RNA to then start to make more RNA and to copy versions of itself. And so intuitively, in the substance itself, you have the process by which you can make more of it. Once you have, a strand of nucleotides that has, 10 base pairs, you might be able to make that same strand over and over again simply because it acts as this crystal structure that can then just passively copy itself. And once you have that, then you can get maybe some amino acids, which are the constituents of proteins, that come onto the RNA and associate with it. And so you get this blend of RNA and proteins, and eventually you get DNA, and then you get cells. But you can probably see that this is like a little bit of an unsatisfying model because you have a lot of free parameters. You have molecules that have to form and maintain in high concentrations that are being torn apart by the environment. And Darwin was one of the first people to really sit around and think about the origin of life, right? So Darwin is this kind of good-for-nothing kid. He's like failed at all of the things that he's ever tried at. He's like a terrible disappointment to his parents. And somebody's like, I need someone to come with me on this voyage on this ship, and we're going to go all around the world, and we need somebody to be the naturalist on board. And Darwin thinks about it, and he takes the job, and it changes the rest of his life, right? Because he has this naturally analytical mind, and he starts going around the world and cataloging these animals, and he starts to realize that there must be some relationship between them. Because before Darwin, it was, again, spontaneous generation. God made all of the animals, he filled the earth with them, that's the origin of all species. And Darwin's going around and he's like, well, this species kind of looks like this species, and then you have this island where you have a bunch of finches, and all of the finches look the same, except their beaks are different, and their beaks are different because they're all feeding off of different things, and so, my God, it's radiative evolution, and they change based off of their food sources, and he comes up with this holistic theory for how species form. And then he's left with this crushing question. He's like, okay, so if the doctrine of the church is incorrect about the origin of species, and I think that species form through gradual changes accumulated over time, what does that mean for life on Earth in general? And so he was really disturbed by this because he was like, I think that it must have happened somewhere on the surface and began very, very simply in some kind of warm little pond. And so for a long time, our model for where all of this chemistry could have happened was this Darwin's warm little pond idea, where there was basically just stuff on the surface that had enough organic materials on it. And that was just where life was. There was sunlight, there was warmth, there was nutrients, there was water. Great, perfect. But the problem is that when you just have this undifferentiated pool of water, you can't do complex chemistry in abundance. Complex chemistry in abundance is one of the hallmarks of life. And so in order to get there, you have to have life. And so you have this like unsolvable conflict of what came first, the chicken or the egg. So the way that people dealt with it is they were like, okay. It wasn't on the surface. It was inside of these geothermal vents. And the fact that it was inside of geothermal vents was plausibly, so these are at the bottom of the ocean. There's this place called the Lost World, I think they call it. Like biologists love to give things really dramatic names. And so they were doing mapping of the ocean floors, and they were actually sending submersibles down to look at what was down there. And they found all of these areas where they were just these massive vents at the bottom of the ocean that were just pumping up huge quantities of geothermal fluids. And they called them black smokers. And black smokers, you can see one in the picture, these are vents that have hundreds of degrees, the water that comes out of them is hundreds of degrees. It's really rich in inorganic chemicals that are coming from the earth, because what you get is you get cracks in the seafloor, the water filters down through the seafloor, it's heated by the internal heat of the earth, and then at the fissures that are at the ocean, at the crustal margins inside of the ocean, all of that water comes back up in the superheated fashion. And you can see that the smoker is covered in life. This was stunning. Nobody thought that you could get life this deep in the ocean because they were like, well, you need light, you need the nutrient cycling patterns of the surface. And then they go down there and they're like, wow, there's tube worms and there's fish and there's weird crabs and there's bacteria and there's all these things. But it still can't be the place where life began because these are really violent environments. Like you need a stable, protected place for life to begin because you need to accumulate complexity in abundance. And so this didn't work. And they were like, okay. And a couple of years later, someone was doing another survey of the sea floor and they found a different set of smokers. They called them white smokers, which were basically the same, but instead of having water coming at them, out of them that was really aggressively pressurized, these were gentle environments where the water was able to very slowly filter through these magnificently intricate caverns. And it turns out that the caverns were filled with the exact energetic gradients that were necessary to begin life. So in order to make life, you have to have, so let me take a step back. In order for life to work, you have to have an energy gradient inside of the cells, right? So if you think about any one of your cells, there's a gradient of ions across the membrane. If you think about a neuron, this is like the most common place where we think of the signaling of cells, you have a different concentration of sodium and potassium on either side of the membranes. And as that changes, equalizes, or shifts, that's what an action potential inside of a neuron is. It's basically you're using this membrane potential to do work and to transmit information, but all cells have an energetic gradient. The metabolism that powers all cells is also based on this kind of gradient. It's all chemistry at the end of the day. But what it is that you have, if you bring this down to motion, what it does is you're creating these dams inside of your cells where you can push things through turbines in order to make those turbines rotate and to produce energy, literally like a dam. And you guys, I don't know if you remember high school biology, but at the heart of metabolism is this thing called the F1, F0 ATP synthase, which is like a big name for a protein that is literally an electromagnetic turbine that produces ATP that powers your cells. And so you have a dam, a reservoir of charged atoms that then fall through this turbine and through the falling produce something that can be used elsewhere in the cell to do work. And that's why people think that membranes are so important for the origin of life. And so they didn't really like surface waters for this because you can't form membranes in them. But these smoker vents that have super alkaline water on the inside of them and more basic water on the outside of them basically create what's called a proton gradient. Your cells use a proton gradient in order to generate ATP inside of your mitochondria, and it's the same thing here. So it's basically like the shape of the vents creates something that looks like a cell without being a cell. It has all the chemistry, it has all the particles, it has all the molecules inside of the wall of it that you need. And so this is one possible version of events. But the problem here is that if you have a chemical structure, like if you have the wall of the vent, and the wall of the vent is your approximation for a membrane, you can never leave. Like you're always going to be attached to the wall of the vent, right? So here you have like the wall of the vent is on the left, and you have the proto-molecule that's on the right. But the thing is that there's no clear path between the wall of the vent and the free molecule. Like nobody has solved that question. And so this seems like it might be a dead end.
You mean like protocell?
Yes. What did I say?
Protomolecule.
Sorry, protomolecule. I'm thinking of the expanse. No, the protocell. So the protocell is something that is the first thing that lives freely that's kind of like beginning to approximate the actions of life, but is not yet life. And if you cannot figure out how to go from rocky membrane that has the right mechanisms and chemistry to something that is soft, squishy, and free living, you have something that is the beginning of a useful theory, but it's not done yet. And so there's this guy, Nick Lane, who works on this stuff. And Nick Lane, he's a professor, I think that like at University College London, I think. And he and his lab is basically trying to recreate these environments inside of laboratory conditions to see if they can get to cells. They have not been successful, and there's a lot of people that think that he will never be successful. And the people who think that he will never be successful are often big proponents of a new version of Darwin's warm little pond. Because we were like, okay, Darwin's warm little pond doesn't work because how do you get enough nutrients in there? How do you get the right conditions? You have just this massive pond that mixes, and it's just highly implausible. We have to move away from it. But geothermal pools are a really interesting model for how life could have formed because there's a lot of evaporation and wet-dry cycling that happens inside of them. And so your first question is like, okay, so let's say early Earth, we accept that early Earth had a lot of geothermal activity on it, right? Like it was very tectonically active. Dr. DeLay was saying that volcanic activity was probably a huge source of the atmosphere and all of the water and like a ton of the stuff that we see. So okay, early Earth, super volcanically active. So we must have a lot of geothermal pools. But the fact that you have pools is insufficient to start to move towards life because you have to have all of these different building blocks. And all of the different building blocks have to do with organic molecules. And the organic molecules we have not been able to show that organic molecules can form in situ on Earth. These are like the raw building blocks, the things that are compounds of carbon and nitrogen and oxygen that can be then folded into the process of life. And so the current thinking is that it was brought to Earth from the rest of the solar system. So we actually went to go, this guy Bruce Damer, who's one of the guys who works, he's one of the big proponents of this geothermal pool theory. He's a professor at the Biota Institute at UC Santa Cruz. And I read his papers, and I looked at what he said about that, okay, so it was these chondrites, which are agglomerations from the super early solar system that have tons of organic molecules in them. They have DNA, or not DNA, they have the building blocks of proteins, they have the building blocks of DNA, they have the building blocks of RNA. And I kind of read it and I was I was skeptical. I was like, well, yeah, that seems perhaps possible, but how much of this stuff would you need in order to rain down on the earth to create sufficiently high concentrations, which would then allow you to start to go into the process of actually building cells? And we went to go see him, and he had a little jar. It was just a glass vial that had just a slick of powder of this chondrite at the bottom of it. And we talked about the origin of life, and he has this theory about protocells, which I'll go into in a second. But his theory needs the organic materials. And he's like, I want you to smell this. And he opens up the container, and it is literally it's just dust inside of it, barely anything. And it is the most otherworldly smell that I have ever sensed in my entire life. And in that moment, I was like, I believe it. Because there's so much stuff that doesn't smell like rocks inside of that container. And there were so many meteorites falling onto Earth during the formation of the Earth when everything was still hot and it was being bombarded by all of these leftovers from the chaos of the solar system, that if they were like that chondrite, which people think that they were, that stuff would have rained massive quantities of organic molecules down on Earth. It was totally dry. There was literally like just powder, like a tiny bit of powder at the bottom of the vial. And he had it for years, and still it was giving off that smell. And so something that was incredibly robust and long-living that was inside of that vial that suggests you have long-living chemistry that came from somewhere else to Earth that was able to seed the stuff that was necessary to begin. The smell, like, I don't know if you've ever smelled wet rock or like rock dust. If you've ever worked with like gravel or dirt, it has this like kind of dry, thick, just dullness to it. You smell it and it's just like your whole sense dulls. This stuff smells like life. It smells like, it was kind of electric. It had this kind of fuzziness to the smell of it that was unbelievable that it could have come from outer space. And so, okay, you have geothermal pools, you have chondrites. This is what the chondrites look like, right? They're just agglomerations of stuff. They're thought to be agglomerations of just raw materials left over from the formation of the solar system. But the solar system, there's this, what is it called? The pebble problem? The pebble to boulder?
Yeah, the meter boundary problem we talked about.
Yeah, so like it's hard to imagine this thing just being formed by the agglomeration of stuff. So this could be the most basic form of panspermia. Like if there was a planet that had stuff on it that broke up, and this is what is left, and then that lands on Earth, that to me is a plausible version of panspermia, because then you just have chemistry that comes, and that chemistry is able to start stuff. So Bruce Damer's idea is that you can have surfaces in these geothermal environments that act as templates for the formation of cells. And once you get the cells off of the organics will eventually cover let me start over. So this is basically a vision of how you can get cells. So you have lipids that dry on a surface, and the surface is usually made of clay or silica or rock, and these are really crystalline surfaces. And lipids are also very geometric molecules. Like if you've ever looked at a biology diagram of lipids, they're these mosaics that form of repeated shapes. And so you can have these thin films of lipids that form these kind of like double-sided pancakes.
Where do the lipids come from?
The lipids come from the chondrites. So the chondrites bring the lipids, they concentrate inside of these pools, and then they get concentrated also by evaporation, right? Because you have periods of hot weather, you have periods of rain. As it's hot and dry, you evaporate, and the evaporation forces the lipids to concentrate around the edge of the pool. Like think about if you have a salt solution, if you have like a salty beverage or something and you let it evaporate, it leaves a ring. That ring is where those protocells would be forming. And so as those protocells form and they incorporate within them some of the organic molecules that were brought from elsewhere, then they're able to create these little stable pockets in which chemistry can occur, and you don't have the same problem that you have at the black smoker vents because you don't have something that is physically, mineralogically locked to the Earth. You have something that can move. And so Damer's idea is that once you get these little protocells that can bleb off, that have organic compounds in them, then they get dispersed across the environment and they are selected by the various pools and river valleys and various wet environments that they land in. They incorporate other chemistry that is concentrated by the landscape, and eventually you start to accumulate sufficiently complex chemistry inside of the protocells that the protocell is able to like split in half and make a copy of itself. And once it's made a copy of itself, then it goes through the entire cycle again, it gets bigger, blebs, and now you have like a metabolic regime that at least mirrors what life is. And like I want to emphasize that the details of this are still deeply mysterious. Like we have not worked this out. And so if this is at all interesting to you, this is a very active field of research where people want to know how this happened. And no one knows yet. And whoever can figure it out and come up with a plausible mechanism will be remembered for forever, I think. For as long as their civilization is around, at least.
Until somebody has a better idea.
That is, yes, exactly. So we kind of talked about panspermia. So a lot of times people talk about panspermia as being with bacteria and with like, because there's this type of bacteria that's lived on Earth for a really long time. They're called firmicutes, and firmicutes make spores. Spores can survive transport in outer space. And so people are like, well, if they can survive transport in outer space, perhaps they're the things that were brought as seeds from the breakup of a different planet. Like, have you talked about how Earth might be from a different solar system?
No.
So like Earth is weird, and there's these periods in Earth's history that are icy periods. So there's this period of, we'll get to the Cambrian explosion in a little bit, but there's this period of time about 500 million years ago where all of the life forms that we see on Earth today appeared, so like all the vertebrates, all the complex life forms. And beforehand, we had really weird body plant life forms on Earth. And we think that it got really, really cold for a really long time, and then it got warm again, and when it got warm again, that's when life as we know it today emerged. And so it's plausible that that really, really cold period could have been from like a solar system transit.
Not just really cold, but the whole thing was covered in ice, right? Kilometers of ice.
Yeah, like snowball Earth is what it's called. And there's weird things. Do you guys know what the Great Unconformity is in the Grand Canyon?
What?
The Great Unconformity. If you go down to the bottom of the Grand Canyon, you get to this basalt, which is basically as old as the Earth is. And then as you start to climb out of the Grand Canyon, you get to this place where the basalt is just smoothly cut off. And then the rock that sits on top of it is 500 million years younger than the rock that it directly sits on. So there's a 500 million years of rock that's missing from the Grand Canyon. And everybody's like, that's pretty weird. And we don't have an explanation for what happened, but it happened around the same time as snowball Earth. And so people were like, okay, maybe it was the like kilometers of glacier that just shaved it flat. And then there's a lot of transition for a long time afterwards. And so you have this, what's called an unconformity in geology, like rock types that aren't directly related to each other, sitting on top of each other.
All that ice would be heavy.
Mm.
And would it have evaporated, or most of it would have evaporated, or?
I think that it would have just gone back into the water cycle. Like it would have filled the ocean basins and it would have fallen as rain and it would have become part of the cycle that we know today. So one of the crazy things is that if you go down into the Earth, I think like halfway through the mantle, there's this hydrated layer, which they think has 7 times the amount of water in that layer as this magnesium hexahydrate. So like magnesium can hold on to a bunch of different water molecules. So they think that there's this huge interior ocean that's complexed to the rocks inside of the Earth. And so some of the water from it could have gone into the geothermal cycle, and so it's unclear. There's a lot of really weird theories about the Earth that I'm not going to lay down here at this moment. I will permit you to explore them on your own time. But there's definitely weird things that happened in the history of the planet. So the planet might not have always been inside of the solar system. If it came from a different solar system, it could be that life got seeded there and then, and what we have now today is not a product of our own solar system, but is the product of this long evolution of the planet that is kind of disjointed from its present surroundings. But
Not a popular theory.
not a popular theory. I'm not presenting this as fact. This is just...
People hate catastrophism.
They do. So it's really, really vital for us as a species to believe that things have always been the way that they are and they will always continue to be the way that they are. Because most civilizations end when the climate changes. And it's a really unnerving thing to be sitting on the cusp of the earth and to realize that. Because you're like, that's pretty much what's always ended everybody. And what people tend to do is they start to they start to do weird things because they think that they will fix it. But the reality is that we live at the mercy of the elements at the end of the day. And so the Earth might have been doing weird things. Life could have come from somewhere else. Viruses, I think, might be a plausible source. So are viruses alive or dead? Okay, alive. Do we have anybody for dead? Do we have anybody for not alive? Okay. Well, so viruses are weird because they require the operating system of a living being in order to run. They're basically like programs that get shuttled around in order to function, right? It's like, it's a little bit dated, but yeah, floppy disks. And so there are people who believe that viruses could have seeded life, because if you have enough viruses, let's say that viruses are just crystalline forms that are produced by planets, right? So you have planets that age to a certain degree, their chemistry settles, and then they're able to start producing really, really, really tiny, simple proteins. So they're not complex proteins. They're very simple. Like the smallest protein is like polypeptides is the short form of a protein. Proteins are like long chains. 3 amino acids. Like you can make a 3 amino acid polypeptide. You can make a 10 amino acid polypeptide. And a virus is just a geometric assembly of these things. And so you can imagine them being formed somewhere and then being brought to Earth where they mix together. And as they mix together, you have these crystalline shapes that form membranes, and the membranes are sufficiently strong to be able to withstand changes in chemistry. And then you get to skip the entire protocell thing, and you already have these proteinaceous viruses. Because there's huge viruses. There's viruses like tupanovirus is basically the size of a cell. And the only real difference between it is that it's missing a couple of proteins that actually make it functional as a living being to be able to work without somebody else's hardware. And so the viruses is one of my favorite theories. But in the last few minutes, we're gonna speed through the chemistry as it changes Earth. So basically, life forms in the absence of oxygen. But we all live in the presence of oxygen. How does it change? It changes because there is a photosynthetic algae called cyanobacteria, technically a bacteria, that develops the ability to produce oxygen as a consequence of sunlight. And so it can do photosynthesis. Photosynthesis basically destroys the world. It kills everything that is on the surface of the planet prior to its arrival, because oxygen is incredibly toxic. Oxygen inside of cells rips things to pieces, and no one has the defenses that are able to deal with it. And so there's a catastrophic extinction event. Everything changes on Earth. All of the chemistry changes. So the iron is one of the most important molecules for life. And so if you go down into the bacterial world, all bacteria are pretty much preoccupied with how to get enough iron out of the environment that has not yet been destroyed by oxygen. And so they have all these molecules. They spend a tremendous amount of time making molecules that go out in the world, scavenge iron, bring them back into the cells so they can stick them in their proteins, because the metals are important for being able to make functional membranes, or not membranes, membrane proteins that are able to do the kind of electrochemistry that you need for metabolism. Like if any of you remember the electron transport chain, that all works on the back of iron proteins. And so when oxygen shows up, there's a really dramatic change in the iron concentrations, and it causes the oceans to rust. Like you see these great orange cliffs in Sedona and in the southwest. That's the rusting of the oceans that happens. And so you can imagine that this is just like a catastrophic event. And it's weird because we don't think of oxygen as a catastrophic event. But the arrival of oxygen gives rise to complex life, because prior to that, you depended on breathing rocks. And the reason that most organisms don't breathe rocks is because rocks suck to breathe. They don't give you, if you think about the metabolic payoff of any metabolic reaction, you have your source and you have your sink. And if your source and sink are really close together, you live in this very, very narrow window of energy. Like you don't have a lot of power, right? Like your windmill turns very, very slowly. And as you start to increase the gap between the source and the sink, you start to be able to turn that turbine much faster. And oxygen is a huge, so sugar to oxygen is like the biggest source to sink that you can get physiologically. Nothing else is that good. And so when oxygen shows up, then you can start to take sugars and you can start to basically dump their decay products onto oxygen to make carbon dioxide and water. And that's how all of life works. Without it, we would not have complex life. So everything died, but gave rise to everything that is good and everything that is us. And so this is a radiative map of evolution. And so life begins basically 4 billion years ago in the form of bacteria and archaea. They're the most ancient, they're the most adapted. We have no sense of the true lineage of bacteria because bacteria are really promiscuous and they just switch their DNA around. And so our map of like the last universal ancestor, blurry. We have no idea, but we know that they're old. We know that they were here first. And everything radiates out from them. And we are bare newcomers. Like if you look at that far, far end where it says today, there's like this little blue line at the edge, which is where humans came around. And so we are not the final, hopefully. We are the product of an immense chain of many, many changes that have happened on the earth. And I want to leave you with this idea of what's the point, which is that planets appear to give life. I have a feeling that when we go to any planet and we dig down below the surface, we will find some rudimentary form of life. Some protocell, some early reaction that will one day, in good conditions, become cells. If that life never becomes intelligent, if that life never becomes able to do stuff the way that we do stuff, everything that ever happens on that planet dies with that planet. All planets die, all suns die. Without complex life that emerges from the swamps and moves towards leaving the planet, everything is for nothing. And so there is a way of looking at the planet, it's called the Gaia hypothesis, that the planet is an organism that acts as a whole, and that we are the product of that organism. And so it is fair to see ourselves as the seeds of the fruit of life. And it is our job to make sure that what is here survives, because without someone who is able to build rockets and to explore and to understand mechanism, the sun will go out, the planet will die, and everything that has ever happened here will be for nothing. And I think that that's kind of a pretty cool place for us to occupy.
Nice.